There is a particular kind of man who does not look at a darkening sky and feel dread. He looks at it and begins to calculate. He reads the color of the clouds, the way another man might read a page. Not with alarm, but with the quiet discipline of someone who has spent decades translating the language of the world around him into the vocabulary of survival. In the high country of the southern Appalachians, where the ridgelines of East Tennessee cut hard shadows across the Clinch River Valley and the hollows of Haywood County fill with fog before the rest of the county wakes, this kind of man was not rare. He was simply the man your family needed him to be. The question people ask when they learn about the old mountain way of living is always some version of the same thing. How did they manage? How did families endure weeks sealed into their cabins by snow that rose above the windowsills, with no electricity, no running water, no road in or out of the hollow? How did men hunt in temperatures that dropped to 20 and 30 degrees below freezing across the high peaks of the Great Balsam Mountains in Haywood County, North Carolina, some of which crest above 6,000 feet and receive close to 100 inches of snowfall in a severe year? How did the long hunters, those extraordinary solitary figures who vanished into the wilderness for 6 and 7 months at a time, manage to return at all? The answer is that they rarely feared winter because they had learned, over generations, to prepare for it with a seriousness and a completeness that the modern world has largely abandoned. Fear, in their understanding, was what happened when you were unprepared. Preparation was not a task they began in October. It was a state of mind that lasted all year. To understand why, you have to stand in the mountains themselves. The southern Appalachians are among the oldest mountain ranges on Earth. Geologists estimate they began forming more than 300 million years ago, in an era when the North American continent was still colliding with what would become Africa and Europe. The erosion of those hundreds of millions of years has smoothed the peaks but not diminished them. The high peaks of the Great Smokies, which straddle the border between Tennessee and North Carolina, still rise above 6,000 feet. Clingman's Dome, the highest point on the Appalachian Trail, sits at 6,643 feet above sea level. And in winter, its summit is frequently buried under ice and wind that would strip the skin from an unprepared man in minutes. The Roan Highlands, which straddle the border between Carter County in Tennessee and Avery County in North Carolina, regularly see wind gusts exceeding 70 miles per hour in January. These are not gentle hills. They are ancient, indifferent, and brutally efficient at punishing anyone who underestimates them. The first permanent Euro-American settlers to enter this landscape arrived in the Watauga River Valley of what is now northeastern Tennessee in the 1760s and early 1770s, a mix of Scots-Irish, English, and Highland Scots who had drifted south and west along the great valleys of the Blue Ridge. William Bean, recognized as the first recorded permanent European settler in Tennessee, built his cabin near Boone's Creek in the Watauga watershed around 1769. These early arrivals were not following roads or maps. They were following game trails, river courses, and the knowledge of men like Daniel Boone, who had spent years learning the mountains with a devotion that bordered on religious. Boone himself had wintered in the Clinch River Valley in what is now Scott County, Virginia, sleeping through blizzards in lean-tos of bark and hides, eating whatever the frozen woods could provide, learning in the most unforgiving classroom imaginable. What Boone and the long hunters who preceded the permanent settlers had learned, and what they passed along through demonstration, story, and quiet instruction, was that the mountains gave you everything you needed to survive them, provided you were paying attention. The forests of the southern Appalachians were, and remain, among the most biologically diverse temperate forests on the planet. The region serves as a refugium, a place where species survived the ice ages because the geography permitted them to shift altitude rather than latitude. That biological richness meant that a man who truly knew these woods was never without resources. The challenge was in the knowing. That knowing began with reading the world before winter arrived. The men of the Appalachians had inherited, refined, and expanded a body of natural observation that functioned as an atmospheric instrument of extraordinary accuracy. In Harlan County, Kentucky, where the Black Mountain Range includes the state's highest point at 4,145 feet, Families watched the woolly bear caterpillar with the same attention a meteorologist gives a pressure system. A caterpillar whose brown band was narrow and crowded by black on both ends was a warning. The coming winter would arrive early, bite hard, and stay long. They watched the thickness of the corn husks at harvest. Thicker husks meant the plant had sensed a harder winter coming and built its own insulation. They watched the behavior of the gray squirrels in the chestnut and oak stands along the ridgetops. A squirrel that buried its acorns with unusual urgency and depth in September was not a creature acting on instinct alone, in the mountain understanding. It was an instrument of the forest, and it was telling you something. The mast crop, the collective yield of acorns, hickory nuts, chestnuts, and beech nuts that carpeted the forest floor in autumn, was itself a forecast. In years when the mast was heavy and abundant, when the oaks shed so thickly that walking through the woods sounded like walking across gravel, the mountain families understood that the forest was preparing to sustain the animals through a long and brutal cold season. That meant their larders needed to sustain them through the same. A heavy mast year was not good news. It was a warning wrapped in abundance, and the men who received it went back to the woodpile and split more logs. The woodpile itself was a statement of intent. A man in the Watauga Valley, or along the Nolichucky River in what is now Unicoi County, Tennessee, who arrived at November with less than 3 cords of split hardwood stacked and covered beside his cabin, was, by the standards of his neighbors, dangerously underprepared. 3 cords was the minimum for a single-room cabin with a stone fireplace. Many families maintained 4 or 5, and the work of producing them, felling, limbing, cutting, splitting, stacking, and covering, occupied much of August and September. The wood had to be split and stacked with air gaps so it could dry. Green wood burns cold and smoky and fills a cabin with the kind of haze that damages lungs over a winter. Seasoned wood, split fine and dry, burns hot and clean. The difference was not comfort. It was survival. The cabins themselves were built to the logic of cold. A well-constructed Appalachian log cabin was not simply 4 walls and a roof. The logs were notched at the corners with a precision that required no nails and left no gaps. The half-dovetail joint, common across the southern Appalachians, locked each log to the one below and above it with a tightness that tightened further under the weight of snow on the roof. The gaps between logs, the chinking, were filled with a mixture of clay, moss, and sometimes horsehair or animal hair pressed deep into the cracks and then sealed with more clay. The result, when done properly, was a wall that the wind could not find. Finding the weak chinking was one of the first tasks of autumn maintenance, and men moved along their cabin walls with the same attention a boatwright gives his hull before winter. The fireplace was the heart of the structure, and understanding fire, real fire, not the recreational fire of a backyard pit, was perhaps the most fundamental skill a mountain man possessed. The Long Hunters carried what was called a strike-a-light kit, a piece of flint, a curved steel striker, and a small tin or leather pouch of charcloth, which was cotton or linen charred in a controlled burn until it was blackened but not reduced to ash. A single strike of flint against steel threw a shower of sparks, and a competent man could land those sparks on charcloth, blow the ember into a flame, and have a fire burning from nothing in under 3 minutes, even in a driving snow. This was not a trick. It was a survival competency as essential as any other, and it was practiced until it was automatic. Beyond starting fire, the mountain men understood wood in ways that have almost entirely vanished from the modern world. They knew that tulip poplar split straight and dried fast but burned quickly and left little coal. They knew that hickory burned hot and long, producing coals that held their heat for hours. The ideal wood for a night fire that would still be glowing at 3 in the morning. They knew that black locust, one of the densest hardwoods native to the southern Appalachians, burned so hot that it could crack a fireplace stone if used carelessly. They knew that chestnut oak, found along the drier ridge tops above 3,000 feet, split easily but needed a full summer of drying before it burned cleanly. This was not general knowledge. It was precise, earned and passed from father to son and neighbor to neighbor across decades of cold winters. The management of heat inside a cabin was equally sophisticated. A fire that burned too high too fast consumed wood wastefully and drove the temperature of a small room to levels that actually made sleep impossible. Experienced woodsmen banked their fires at night, building a deep bed of coals, covering them with a thick layer of ash to slow oxidation, and laying 1 or 2 large pieces of hardwood directly against the banked coals. The ash acted as insulation, slowing the burn and making the fuel last until first light. In the morning, the coals were still alive beneath the ash, and a cabin that might have dropped to near freezing overnight could be brought back to livable warmth within 20 minutes. This technique, practiced across every cabin from the Virginia highlands to the Georgia hills, meant that families could sleep through the night without keeping a fire watch. It meant that no one had to freeze while waiting for a fire to be rebuilt from scratch in a dark cabin at 4 in the morning. Food was the other pillar of winter preparation, and the complexity of what the Appalachian families managed before the first hard frost is difficult to appreciate without understanding how long and complete their isolation could become. The winter of 1886, recorded in family journals and county histories across East Tennessee, Western North Carolina, and Kentucky as the deep snow, brought storms that sealed hollows for weeks at a time. Families in the remote coves of Haywood County, where Cold Mountain rises to 6,030 feet in the Great Balsam Range, and the roads in those years were wagon tracks that disappeared under 2 feet of snow, could go 6 or 8 weeks without any contact with the outside world. Everything they ate, everything they burned, and everything they used during those weeks had to already be inside the cabin, or the smokehouse, or the root cellar. The smokehouse was the mountain family's first line of defense. In the weeks following hog killing time, typically after the first hard freeze in late October or November, when cold temperatures could be counted on to keep the meat from spoiling during the curing process, hams, shoulders, and sides of pork were rubbed with a mixture of salt and brown sugar, sometimes with black pepper or red pepper added, and hung in the smokehouse over a slow, constant fire of hickory or apple wood. The smoking was not quick. A properly cured ham spent weeks in the smokehouse, the smoke penetrating the meat and depositing creosoles and phenols that inhibited the bacteria responsible for decay. Done correctly, a smoked ham needed no refrigeration and would remain safe to eat for a year or more. Men who killed a 400-pound hog in November, and hogs in the mountains ran large, fed on the same mast crop that fattened the bears, could put enough salt-cured pork into a smokehouse to see a family through until the following spring. But pork alone would not sustain a family for months of hard winter work. The men of the mountains hunted throughout the cold season, and this was not a recreational pursuit. Deer, black bear, wild turkey, ruffed grouse, gray squirrel, and rabbit were all pursued through the snow with a methodical commitment that bore no resemblance to modern sport hunting. A man tracking deer through fresh snow in the Clinch Mountains of Claiborne County, Tennessee, was reading a text as specific as any written record. The length of the stride told him how fast the animal was moving. The depth of the track told him how recently it had been made. A sharp, crisp edge meant minutes. A degraded, icy edge meant hours. The way the track led toward or away from terrain features told him where the animal was bedding, where it was feeding, and which ridge it would use to move between the two. A man who could read those signs could reliably find deer in conditions that made the forest look empty to an untrained eye. The meat taken in winter hunts was preserved in multiple ways. In the simplest method, the cold itself served as a freezer. Carcasses hung in a cold shed or smokehouse would stay frozen for weeks in the deep of January. Venison cut into thin strips and dried over a slow hickory smoke fire became jerky that could be carried in a hunting bag and eaten on the trail without any further preparation. A more calorie-dense preparation, borrowed from the knowledge of the Cherokee and other native peoples of the region, and adapted by the long hunters who spent months at a time in the backcountry, was a form of concentrated trail food made from dried, ground venison, mixed with rendered deer or bear, fat and sometimes dried wild berries. A preparation that provided extraordinary caloric density in a small, portable package. A man crossing the Appalachian Mountains in December on a long hunt could carry a week's worth of fuel in a pouch the size of his fist. Bear fat, in particular, occupied a place of almost sacred importance in the mountain economy of winter. A black bear killed in late autumn, after months of hyperphagia during which it consumed up to 20,000 calories per day preparing for hibernation, might carry 80 or 90 pounds of fat on a large male. That fat was rendered slow-cooked in a kettle until the connective tissue separated and the pure liquid fat could be poured off, and stored in crocks sealed with cloth or leather. It served a dozen purposes simultaneously. It was a cooking fat, used in cast-iron pans over the hearth for everything from cornbread to fried venison to the dried beans that formed the dietary backbone of winter meals. It was a lubricant for tools, rifle mechanisms, and leather goods, rubbed onto the boots and the seams of leather garments. It waterproofed them against the wet snow of the southern Appalachian winter, which frequently arrived not as the dry powder of higher latitudes, but as a heavy, wet, soaking mass that could saturate wool and leather in minutes. And it was a source of light, rendered into tallow and poured around a twisted cotton wick in a shallow clay or iron dish. Bear and deer fat burned for hours, providing the soft, yellow light by which families spent their winter evenings, mending gear, sharpening tools, sewing moccasins, and telling the stories that carried knowledge from one generation to the next. The tallow candle and the grease lamp were not quaint. They were the technological infrastructure of the mountain winter evening, and the men and women who made them did so with the same practical seriousness they brought to everything else. An Appalachian family that went into winter with a well-stocked candle and lamp supply could work during the long, dark hours of January and February, maintaining tools, repairing harness leather, working on the 100 small tasks of household economy that couldn't be done during the short daylight hours of outdoor labor. A family that ran out of light in February was confined to doing nothing after dark, which in the mountains in winter meant nothing after 4:30 in the afternoon. In a world where every hour had a use, running out of light was a serious failure. The men themselves, the mountain men in the most complete sense of the phrase, the hunters and trackers and long hunters who spent the most time in the deep woods in the worst conditions, had developed a set of practices around cold weather movement and shelter that were equal in sophistication to anything produced by formal military survival training in later centuries. They dressed in layers before the word was applied to that strategy. The inner layer was often linen or wool against the skin. Over that went a hunting shirt of heavy linsey-woolsey, a woven blend of linen and wool that provided warmth without the weight of pure wool, belted at the waist to trap body heat. Over the hunting shirt, in severe cold, went a blanket capote, a long overcoat cut and sewn directly from a wool trade blanket, with a hood, open at the front, belted, and capable of being wrapped tightly around the body when still and open for ventilation when moving hard across ridges. The feet were the critical point. Wet feet in below freezing temperatures were a medical emergency in a world without hospitals, and men who operated in deep snow wrapped their feet in layers of wool, then pulled moccasins over the wool, then pulled over the moccasins a pair of outer moccasins made from the fur side out hide of a bear or deer. The dead air space between layers, the same principle that modern insulation relies on, was created by hand and worn on the body. Movement itself was understood as a thermal resource. A man who stopped moving in severe cold began to lose heat immediately, and the rate at which core temperature drops in wet, windy conditions at altitude was something the Appalachian woodsman understood empirically, even without the physiological vocabulary to name it. They moved steadily and deliberately, not running, which caused dangerous sweating that would then chill the body during any stop, but maintaining a pace that kept the body's furnace burning without soaking the inner layers with moisture. When they stopped, they built a fire, and they built it before they were cold, not after. The discipline of building a fire before you need it rather than after you desperately want it, was one of the first lessons passed to anyone who went into the woods for serious winter work. By the time your hands are shaking too badly to hold the striker, the lesson has been learned too late. Shelter in the backcountry, away from the cabin, was constructed with speed and engineering logic that came from long practice. A lean-to of bark slabs leaned against a ridgepole between two trees, open to a fire on its south or east face, provided wind protection and reflective heat that could make a space of 8 or 10 feet genuinely warm even when the air temperature was below zero. The men who built these structures in the mountains of Tennessee and North Carolina knew to dig down through the snow to bare ground before laying their bedding, because snow acts as insulation and the ground beneath it holds residual warmth. They knew to cut boughs from eastern hemlock, a tree whose dense, overlapping needles shed water and provide the deepest cushioning of any native species, and lay them in thick, overlapping layers like scales. Butt ends toward the foot of the bed, so rainwater or snowmelt ran downward rather than toward the sleeping body. A bed of hemlock boughs a foot thick, with a wool blanket above and a fire 3 feet away, was enough to sleep through a night when the temperature outside fell to single digits. What is remarkable in retrospect is not any single one of these skills. It is the totality of them, and the way they interlocked into a system that was almost entirely self-sustaining. The wood kept the fire burning. The fire dried the meat and rendered the fat. The fat lit the lamps and waterproofed the boots. The waterproof boots allowed movement through snow. The movement through snow brought game. The game brought meat and fat and hides. The hides insulated the body and the cabin. Every element supported every other element in a web of interdependence that required nothing from the outside world. Nothing from a store, a supply chain, a government, or a power grid. The men of the Appalachian Highlands had built, over generations, a system of living that was genuinely closed, not by choice, but by necessity, and refined to an elegance that poverty alone cannot explain. Poverty was the pressure. Intelligence and determination and accumulated knowledge were the response. The Great Appalachian Storm of November 1950, a Category 5 cyclone on the Regional Snowfall Index, which dropped 57 inches of snow on parts of the western slope of the Appalachians and killed 383 people across the eastern United States, struck a population that had already abandoned most of this knowledge. Electricity had reached most of the mountain communities by then. Roads had been paved and maintained. The smokehouse was becoming a relic. The woodpile was shrinking. When the storm sealed the hollows and cut the power lines, the families who had kept the old ways, who still maintained their wood piles and their root cellars, and their smoked meat, and their cast iron and their knowledge of how to sustain a fire through a long night, came through it. Those who had not kept those ways found themselves entirely dependent on the outside world to come and rescue them from the consequences of that dependency. It is not sentimental to observe that something was lost in that transition. It is simply accurate. The men of the Appalachian Highlands did not fear harsh winters and severe storms because they had built their lives around a comprehensive, tested, generationally refined understanding of how to meet those conditions on equal terms. They were not naive about the danger. The death records of Haywood County and Harlan County and Unicoi County in the 19th century are full of the consequences of things going wrong, of men lost to exposure, of families weakened by hunger in the last hard weeks of March, when the stores ran thin and the snow still lay deep in the north-facing coves. They knew the mountains could kill them. They knew it every single day. What they had, which we have largely set aside, was the knowledge and the discipline to make it very difficult for the mountains to do so. Somewhere in the remaining hollows of the southern Appalachians, in the high coves of Rabun County in Georgia, along the upper reaches of the Nolichucky in Unicoi County, in the backcountry of the Clench Mountain Wildlife Management Area in Scott County, Virginia, there are still men and women who know pieces of this, who still split and season their own wood, who still keep a smokehouse, who still read the woolly bear and the massed crop and the color of the October sky with the same calculation their great-grandparents brought to those signs. They are not performing tradition. They are practicing competence. And in a world that has engineered fragility into nearly every system it depends on, the question of what we abandoned in exchange for that fragility is one that answers itself every time the power lines go down and the grocery store shelves go empty and the road into the hollow fills with drifting snow. The mountain was always going to be the mountain. The only question was who you were when you stood at the bottom of it and looked up at the darkening sky.